My name is Elsie, and I'm 57 years old. I raised my son Daniel alone after my husband Robert passed away when Daniel was just 12. We built this house together, brick by brick, dream by dream. Every corner holds memories of laughter, tears, and the love that kept us going through the hardest times. But there are things my son doesn't know about this house, things I never thought I'd have to prove. Today, I want to tell you about the day Daniel demanded I hand over my keys and leave the home I built with my own hands. Before I share this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you believe a mother's love can sometimes blind us to harsh truths, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories from a mother's journey. Now let me tell you about the day I thought I lost everything I'd worked so hard to build. I remember the day Robert and I first saw this piece of land like it was yesterday. It was 1992, and Daniel was only 3 years old, toddling around the empty lot while Robert and I stood there dreaming of our future. Robert worked for Henderson Construction Company, and he knew how to build things that would last. We'd spent months looking at houses, but nothing felt right until we found this quarter-acre plot in Maplewood suburbs. Elsie. Robert said that sunny April morning, "This is where we're going to raise our boy." He picked up a handful of soil and let it run through his fingers. The lot was perfect, flat enough for a good foundation, but with a gentle slope toward the back where we could plant a garden. Robert had already started sketching plans on napkins during his lunch breaks, drawing out bedrooms and a big kitchen where we could have family dinners. Daniel helped us break ground by carrying around a tiny plastic hammer that Robert had bought him from the toy store. That little boy was so proud, telling everyone at the grocery store that he was helping Daddy build their house. Robert let Daniel hammer the first stake into the ground for the foundation markers, and we have a photo of that moment hanging in our hallway to this day. The construction took 8 months. Every evening after Robert came home from work, he'd spend another few hours working on our house. Weekends were full of progress, neighbors stopping by to see how things were coming along. Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door, would bring us lemonade and comment on how lucky Daniel was to have such dedicated parents. Robert planted an apple tree in the backyard that first spring. "For Daniel's children someday," he told me, as we watched our 5-year-old son water the tiny sapling with a bright red watering can. "That tree is now 30 feet tall, and every fall it produces the sweetest apples you've ever tasted." Robert never got to see those apples ripen, but every September when I make apple pie from that tree, I feel him right there in the kitchen with us. Our home became the center of everything good in our lives. Birthday parties in the living room. Daniel's friends sleeping over in the basement we finished when he turned 8. Holiday dinners where Robert would carve the turkey at the dining room table he'd built by hand. This house witnessed Daniel taking his first steps across the hardwood floors Robert had installed himself, heard his first words echo through the hallways, saw him grow from a toddler into a smart, capable young man. When Daniel was 10, Robert taught him how to use basic tools in the garage workshop. Together, they built a treehouse in the oak tree by the back fence. Daniel was so excited to show me the progress every day after school, dragging me outside to see the latest boards they'd nailed up. That treehouse became his fortress, his reading spot, his place to think and dream about his own future. Everything changed on a cold February morning when Daniel was 12 years old. The phone call came at 6:15 in the morning, and I knew before I even answered that something terrible had happened. Robert had been killed in an accident at a construction site downtown. A crane malfunction, they said. Quick and painless, they said, as if words like that could somehow make the devastation easier to bear. The funeral was packed with Robert's coworkers, neighbors, and friends from Daniel's school. Everyone said such beautiful things about the man who'd built not just houses, but lasting relationships with everyone he met. But all I could think about was how we were going to survive without him, how I was going to raise Daniel alone, how I was going to keep the house that Robert had built with so much love and hope. The reality hit fast and hard. Robert's life insurance policy helped with immediate expenses, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover the mortgage payments long term. I had been working part-time as a receptionist at Riverside Medical Center, but that income alone wouldn't be enough to keep us afloat. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, I'd taken on a second job doing weekend catering for parties and events around town. 3 months later, I added a third job cleaning office buildings downtown from 10 at night until 2 in the morning. Some nights I'd come home so exhausted I'd fall asleep in my work clothes on the living room couch, only to wake up at 6 to get Daniel ready for school and head to my day job at the medical center. Daniel, bless his heart, stepped up in ways no 12-year-old should have to. He started cutting grass for neighbors after school, earning $5 or $10 per yard. He got a paper route delivering the Maplewood Gazette every morning before school, riding his bike through the neighborhood in rain or snow. On weekends, he'd help me with the catering jobs, carrying plates and cleaning up after parties for 50 cents an hour. Those were the hardest years of our lives, but also some of the most precious. We'd sit at the kitchen table every Sunday night, counting our money together and planning how to spend every dollar. Daniel learned about mortgage payments, property taxes, and utility bills before he learned algebra. He never complained not once about wearing hand-me-down clothes or eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner when money was especially tight. I spent countless hours after Daniel went to bed studying mortgage documents, property tax assessments, and insurance policies. I had to learn everything Robert had always handled, often feeling overwhelmed and confused by the legal language and financial terms. But I was determined to understand every aspect of what it meant to own this home, to protect what Robert had built for our family. The worst moment came when Daniel was 14 and I had to sit him down to explain that we might lose the house. I'd fallen behind on 2 mortgage payments during a particularly difficult stretch when I'd gotten sick and missed work for a week. Daniel looked at me across that same kitchen table where we'd shared so many family meals and said, "Mom, we can't lose Dad's house. We just can't." That night, Daniel and I made a pact. We would do whatever it took to keep our home. He increased his paper route to include the Sunday edition and started doing yard work for elderly neighbors. I picked up extra catering shifts and began selling homemade cookies and cakes to coworkers at the medical center. Slowly, month by month, we caught up on the payments and started building a small emergency fund. When Daniel graduated high school with a 3.8 GPA, I cried tears of joy and pride. He'd earned a partial scholarship to State University for business administration, and I couldn't have been more proud of the young man he'd become. The boy who'd helped me count pennies at the kitchen table was growing into someone who understood hard work, responsibility, and the value of perseverance. During his college years, Daniel would come home for holidays and summers, often bringing friends who were amazed by our cozy home and the stories of how we'd built it together. He'd show them the treehouse he and Robert had constructed, the workshop in the garage, where he'd learned to use tools, the apple tree that still produced fruit every fall. I loved watching him take pride in our home and our family history. With Daniel away at college and my financial situation finally stable, I started making small improvements to the house. I painted the kitchen a warm yellow that reminded me of sunshine, replaced the worn carpet in the living room with hardwood that matched what Robert had installed years earlier, and updated the bathroom fixtures that had been showing their age. Each improvement felt like honoring Robert's memory, while also making the space truly my own. I planted flower gardens along the front walkway, hung new curtains in the dining room, and even splurged on a new dishwasher after 15 years of washing everything by hand. The house was becoming not just a place where we'd survived difficult times, but a place where I could thrive and enjoy the fruits of our hard work. Daniel's junior year, he started dating a girl named Madison, whom he'd met in his business ethics class. When he brought her home for Thanksgiving that year, I was excited to meet the young woman who'd captured my son's attention. Madison was undeniably beautiful, with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. But there was something cold about her, something calculating in the way she looked around our home. While Daniel was showing her his old bedroom and sharing childhood memories, I caught her taking photos of different rooms with her phone. When I asked about it, she smiled sweetly and said she just wanted to remember Daniel's family home. Something about the way she said it made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. That Thanksgiving dinner, Madison asked detailed questions about the house. When had we bought it? How much had it cost originally? What did I think it might be worth now? I answered politely, assuming she was just making conversation, but her questions felt more like an interview than casual curiosity. Daniel seemed proud to answer her questions about how we'd built the house together after his father died, how hard we'd worked to keep it. After they left that Sunday, I couldn't shake the feeling that Madison had been evaluating our home rather than simply visiting it. But I pushed those concerns aside, telling myself I was just being protective of Daniel and perhaps a little jealous of the first serious girlfriend he'd brought home. I wanted him to be happy, and if Madison made him happy, I would learn to love her too. After Daniel graduated and started working at a marketing firm downtown, his visits home became less frequent and somehow more formal. When he did come by, usually with Madison in tow, the conversations had changed. Instead of asking about my garden or catching up on neighborhood news, Daniel started making comments about the house itself. "Mom, don't you think this living room furniture is getting a little outdated?" he asked during a visit in July. Madison nodded in agreement, suggesting I might want to modernize the space with some contemporary pieces. I'd been proud of the furniture I'd slowly acquired over the years, each piece chosen carefully and paid for in full before bringing it home. During another visit, Daniel walked through the house with what I can only describe as a critical eye, pointing out things I'd never considered problems. The kitchen cabinets were inefficient for the space. The bathroom upstairs needed significant updating, and the basement could be better utilized. Madison chimed in with observations about the potential for improvement throughout the house, but it was the comment about downsizing that really caught my attention. "Mom, have you ever considered that this house might be too much for you to manage alone?" Daniel asked one evening as we sat on the front porch swing Robert had hung 20 years earlier. "I mean, you're getting older and maintaining a property this size is a lot of work." I was 55 years old and in excellent health, hardly ready for a retirement home. I kept up with all the maintenance, enjoyed my garden, and loved having space for Daniel and his future family to visit. The suggestion that I couldn't handle my own home felt insulting, especially coming from the son who'd helped me fight so hard to keep it. Madison seemed to encourage these conversations often, bringing up articles she'd read about senior citizens who'd downsized and been so much happier in smaller spaces. She'd mention retirement communities with wonderful amenities and talk about how freeing it must be to not worry about home maintenance and yard work. During one particularly uncomfortable conversation, Daniel actually suggested I get the house appraised, just to see what your equity situation looks like. When I asked why that would matter, Madison jumped in to explain about smart financial planning and maximizing your assets for retirement. The way they talked about my home like it was simply a financial instrument rather than the place where I'd raised my child and built my life was deeply unsettling. I started noticing that Daniel would walk around the property during visits, taking photos of different angles of the house and yard. When I asked about it, he said he was just documenting family memories, but something about his behavior felt secretive and deliberate. Madison would often disappear during these photo sessions, making phone calls in her car that seemed to go on for a long time. The conversations with my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, became more frequent during this time. She'd noticed the changes in Daniel's behavior too and gently asked if everything was all right with our family. "Young people today seem so focused on money," she observed one afternoon as we chatted over the fence. "Sometimes they forget that a home is about more than just its value on paper." The pressure intensified dramatically that fall when Daniel called to arrange what he described as a family meeting to discuss my long-term plans. He arrived on a Saturday morning with Madison and a briefcase full of documents transforming our cozy dining room into what felt like a corporate boardroom. "Mom, we've done some research into your financial situation." Daniel began spreading papers across the table where we'd shared countless family meals. Madison pulled out her laptop and started a presentation about my current expenses versus my projected needs as I aged. They'd somehow calculated my monthly costs for utilities, property taxes, homeowners insurance, and routine maintenance. The presentation was thorough and professionally prepared, complete with charts showing how much money I was losing each month by staying in a house that was too large for one person. Madison explained their findings like she was addressing a business meeting rather than talking to her boyfriend's mother about her own life and home. They'd researched several senior living communities in the area, each one offering maintenance-free living and social opportunities designed for active seniors. The brochures were glossy and appealing, showing smiling elderly people playing cards and attending exercise classes in beautiful modern facilities. "The Sunset Manor community is particularly impressive," Madison said, clicking through photos on her laptop. "They have a waiting list, but we think we could get you in within 6 months if we start the application process now." Daniel nodded enthusiastically, adding that the timing would be perfect for everyone involved. When I asked what they meant by everyone involved, Daniel exchanged a glance with Madison before explaining that they were hoping to get married next year and start looking for their own home. He'd been doing well at his job, but buying in this market requires a significant down payment. The implication was clear, even though neither of them said it directly. The conversation took another turn when Madison's friend Jeremy arrived, introduced as a financial advisor who specializes in senior transitions. Jeremy had brought his own folder of documents and started explaining concepts like equity release and leveraging property assets for retirement planning. "Mrs. Thompson, you're sitting on a gold mine here," Jeremy said, gesturing around our dining room. "Property values in this neighborhood have increased significantly over the past few years. You could sell this house, pay cash for a nice apartment at Sunset Manor, and still have substantial money left over for investments that would generate monthly income." The numbers they presented made it sound like selling was not just reasonable, but the only logical choice for someone in my situation. Jeremy talked about market trends and interest rates and tax implications until my head was spinning with financial jargon I didn't fully understand. When I tried to express my emotional attachment to the house, Madison gently but firmly redirected the conversation back to practical considerations. Daniel seemed torn between supporting their financial arguments and acknowledging my feelings, but ultimately sided with the rational approach Madison and Jeremy were advocating. "Mom, I know this is hard," Daniel said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "But we're talking about your future security here. Wouldn't it be better to make this transition while you're still young and healthy enough to enjoy a new lifestyle?" I felt cornered and overwhelmed by the pressure, but I wasn't ready to give up the fight for my home. That evening, after Daniel and Madison left with promises to start researching the process, I sat alone in my living room and tried to think clearly about what was happening. Something about their presentation had felt wrong beyond just the emotional pain of being asked to leave my home. The way Jeremy had talked about property values and market conditions suggested they'd been planning this conversation for quite some time. Madison's detailed knowledge of senior living options and Daniel's sudden concern about my long-term welfare seemed too convenient to be spontaneous. I called Mrs. Patterson and asked if she'd noticed anything unusual about Daniel's recent visits. "Well," she said carefully, "I did see a man in a suit walking around your property with Daniel a few weeks ago. They were pointing at different parts of the house and taking measurements or something. I assumed you knew about it." That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Robert and how hard we'd worked to build this life, how proud Daniel had been of our home throughout his childhood, how many family memories lived in these rooms. The idea that my own son was conspiring to manipulate me into selling felt like a betrayal I couldn't quite accept. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to feel like a victim of pressure and manipulation, I would take control of the situation. If Daniel wanted to discuss my financial situation, then I needed to understand exactly what that situation was from a legal perspective. My first stop was First National Bank, where Robert and I had opened our accounts 30 years earlier. I requested a meeting with Mr. Jenkins, the bank manager, who'd known our family since Daniel was a toddler. "Mrs. Thompson," he said warmly, "it's so good to see you. How can I help you today?" "I need to review all my account information and property documents," I told him. "My son has some concerns about my financial situation, and I want to make sure I understand everything clearly." Mr. Jenkins seemed happy to help pulling out thick folders that contained the history of our mortgage property ownership papers and account records. As we reviewed the documents, one thing became crystal clear. The house was entirely in my name. When Robert died, the mortgage company had required me to refinish the loan in my name only, which I'd done successfully after providing extensive documentation of my employment and income. I'd been making payments faithfully for 15 years, and the house had been completely paid off for the past 3 years. "Mrs. Thompson, you should know that your son has called here twice in the past month asking questions about your accounts," Mr. Jenkins mentioned casually as we finished our review. "Of course, we couldn't provide any information without your authorization, but he seemed quite interested in understanding your financial position." Armed with a complete understanding of my legal and financial position, I felt a surge of confidence I hadn't experienced in months. The house was mine, free and clear. I owed no money to anyone, had substantial savings, and was in excellent health. Daniel's concerns about my ability to manage a loan were not just unfounded, they were manipulative. But I decided not to confront Daniel immediately. Instead, I wanted to see just how far he was willing to push this situation. When he called that Tuesday to say they'd like to move forward with the transition plan, I agreed to meet with him again on Saturday morning. "Mom, I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this," Daniel said when I told him I was ready to discuss next steps. "Madison has already contacted Sunset Manor, and they have an opening coming up in January. If we start the paperwork for selling the house now, the timing should work out perfectly." Madison seemed particularly excited about the prospect of finalizing everything quickly. "Mrs. Thompson, I've been in touch with a real estate agent who specializes in this neighborhood," she said. "She thinks your house could sell very quickly, possibly even before the holidays, if we price it competitively." I listened to their plans with growing amazement at how thoroughly they'd organized my future without consulting me. They'd already researched moving companies, identified which of my possessions would fit in a senior living apartment, and even calculated how long it would take to liquidate items I wouldn't need in my new lifestyle. "The sooner we get started, the better," Daniel said. "I'd like to get the keys from you today so Madison and I can start coordinating with the real estate agent about staging and photography." The casual way he made this demand, as if handing over the keys to my home was a simple formality, revealed just how entitled he'd become. When I asked why he needed the keys immediately, Madison explained that potential buyers would want to tour the house multiple times, and it would be easier for everyone if Daniel could coordinate showing times without having to bother me. "You'll be so busy with your transition planning," she added. "This way you won't have to worry about keeping the house perfect for strangers walking through." The conversation continued with Daniel outlining a timeline that had me moved out of my home within 6 weeks. They'd already identified a temporary apartment where I could stay during the transition period before my space at Sunset Manor became available. Every detail had been planned as if my agreement was a foregone conclusion. "I think we should make this official," Daniel said, pulling out a folder of legal documents. "Jeremy prepared some papers that will give Madison and me power of attorney to handle the sale details. It's really just a formality, but it will make the process much smoother." As I looked at my son across the dining room table, demanding my keys and asking me to sign away control of my own home, I realized that the sweet, hard-working boy who'd helped me count pennies and fight to save our house had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. I agreed to meet Daniel and Madison at the bank the next morning, ostensibly to finalize the arrangements they'd proposed. Daniel seemed relieved and excited that I was finally cooperating with their plan. Madison immediately started making phone calls to coordinate with the real estate agent and Jeremy about moving forward with the timeline. That evening, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and asked her to be my witness for something important that was going to happen the next day. I didn't give her details, but I asked her to meet me at First National Bank at 10 o'clock the following morning. "Of course, dear," she said. "Whatever you need." The next morning, Daniel and Madison arrived at my house promptly at 9:30, both dressed professionally as if they were attending an important business meeting. Daniel had brought a briefcase containing more documents, and Madison carried a folder with real estate information and moving timelines. "Mom, I'm really proud of you for making this decision," Daniel said as we drove to the bank. "I know it's not easy, but you're doing the right thing for your future." Madison nodded in agreement, adding that she was excited to help me start this new chapter of my life. When we arrived at First National Bank, Mr. Jenkins greeted us warmly and invited us into his office. Daniel immediately took charge of the conversation, explaining that they were there to discuss transferring authority for my accounts and property to help me manage the transition to senior living. "Mr. Jenkins, we need to discuss my mother's financial situation," Daniel said confidently. "As her son, I'll be handling the sale of her house and helping her relocate to a more appropriate living situation." He spoke with the authority of someone who assumed his relationship to me automatically granted him legal rights to my property. Madison opened her folder and began showing Mr. Jenkins the senior living brochures and real estate materials they'd prepared. "We've done extensive research into the best options for Mrs. Thompson," she explained. "Now we just need to get the financial processes started so we can move forward quickly." Mr. Jenkins listened politely to their presentation, occasionally nodding and making appropriate comments about their thoroughness and preparation. When Daniel finished explaining their timeline and asked about accessing my mother's account information, Mr. Jenkins turned to me with a professional smile. Mrs. Thompson, before we proceed with any changes to your accounts or discuss your property information, I'll need to verify that this is what you want to do, he said. Can you confirm that you're requesting these changes to your account access? This was my moment. I looked at Daniel and Madison, both waiting expectantly for me to give Mr. Jenkins the authorization they needed to take control of my financial life. Instead, I smiled calmly and said, "Actually, I'd like you to explain to my son exactly what my current financial and property situation is." Daniel looked confused. "Mom, we don't need a full review. We just need to get the paperwork started for the house sale." But Mr. Jenkins was already pulling out my account files, the same ones I'd reviewed extensively earlier that week. "Mr. Thompson," he said, addressing Daniel formally, "your mother's accounts are solely in her name. She is the only authorized person who can make changes to these accounts or access this information." He paused to let that information sink in. "The property at your mother's address is owned entirely by Mrs. Thompson with no liens, mortgages, or other claims against it." Madison's confident expression began to falter. "But surely, as her son Daniel has some authority to help with financial decisions," she asked. Mr. Jenkins shook his head politely but firmly. "Not without specific legal documentation giving him power of attorney, which Mrs. Thompson would have to sign voluntarily and have notarized," he explained. "And even then, she would retain the right to revoke that authority at any time." Daniel's face was turning red with embarrassment and frustration. "But Mom, you said you wanted help with this transition. You agreed to let us handle the details." His voice had risen, and other bank customers were beginning to notice our conversation. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I never agreed to anything. You told me what you thought I should do, but you never asked what I wanted to do." I turned to Mr. Jenkins and asked him to explain the property ownership details one more time. "Mrs. Thompson has owned this property outright for 3 years," Mr. Jenkins stated clearly. "The mortgage was paid in full in 2021. She has no debt obligations related to the property and substantial savings in her accounts. From a financial perspective, she is in an excellent position to continue maintaining her current lifestyle indefinitely." The room fell silent as the implications of Mr. Jenkins's words hit Daniel and Madison. All their calculations about my financial necessity to sell, all their pressure about my inability to manage alone, all their assumptions about having some claim to my property, had just been destroyed by simple facts. Madison was the first to recover, though her voice was strained. "But the market analysis showed that selling now would be financially advantageous." She trailed off as she realized how weak that argument sounded in the context of what we'd just learned. Daniel stared at me across Mr. Jenkins's desk, and I could see him processing the realization that his power over this situation had just died in seconds. All his demands, all his pressure, all his plans for my future had been based on assumptions that were completely wrong. "Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Jenkins concluded, "you are under no financial pressure to make any changes to your living situation. The choice is entirely yours to make." The drive home from the bank was silent except for the sound of Madison furiously typing on her phone, probably canceling appointments with real estate agents and senior living coordinators. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension, but he didn't say a word until we pulled into my driveway. "Mom, I don't understand," he finally said, turning to face me in the passenger seat. "Why didn't you tell us your financial situation was so secure? We were just trying to help you plan for the future." His voice carried a mixture of embarrassment and defensiveness that broke my heart. "Daniel, you never asked about my financial situation," I replied gently. "You assumed I was struggling and needed your help, but you never actually asked how I was doing or what I wanted for my future." Madison got out of the car without saying goodbye, walking quickly to her own vehicle parked on the street. That afternoon, Daniel called me from his apartment. "Mom, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Madison and I got carried away with planning and forgot to include you in the decisions about your own life. I'm sorry for pressuring you and for assuming I knew what was best." It was a start, but I could tell that our relationship had been fundamentally changed by what had happened. The trust between us would take time to rebuild, and I wasn't sure Madison would ever forgive me for exposing their plans so publicly. But for the first time in months, I felt peace in my own home. The following weeks brought a gradual return to normalcy. I continued my routine of gardening, visiting with Mrs. Patterson, and enjoying the quiet comfort of the house Robert and I had built together. Daniel visited less frequently, and when he did come by, Madison rarely accompanied him. During one of his solo visits, Daniel sat with me in the kitchen and asked, "Mom, how did you know what they were trying to do?" I explained that it wasn't so much knowing as feeling that something was wrong with their approach. When someone truly cares about your welfare, I told him, they ask what you want, not tell you what you need. We talked honestly about his relationship with Madison and how her ambitions had influenced his perspective on our family situation. Daniel admitted that she'd been pressuring him to secure his inheritance and had suggested that waiting for me to make decisions on my own could result in poor financial planning that would affect their future together. I got caught up in her way of thinking, Daniel confessed. She made it sound like I was being irresponsible if I didn't take control of the situation. But she never understood what this house means to our family, what you and Dad sacrificed to build it. Over the following months, Daniel and Madison's relationship deteriorated as he began to see how her financial motivations had corrupted his judgment about family priorities. Eventually, they broke up and Daniel moved back to town, taking a job that paid less but allowed him to be closer to home. Our relationship slowly healed, but it was different now. Daniel had learned that love doesn't entitle you to make decisions for other people, and I had learned that sometimes the people we love most are the ones we need to stand up to the strongest. We built new boundaries based on mutual respect rather than assumed authority. The house continues to be my sanctuary and my pride. I've made a few more improvements over the years, always mindful of maintaining the character and warmth that Robert built into its foundation. The apple tree still produces fruit every fall, and I still make pies that remind me of all the love and hard work that created this home. Every morning when I sit at my kitchen table with my coffee looking out at the garden I've tended for 30 years, I'm grateful for the strength I found to defend what was mine. This house isn't just a financial asset or a piece of real estate. It's the place where Robert and I raised our son, where we celebrated holidays and weathered storms, where we built a life together that continues even after loss. I've learned that love sometimes means saying no, especially when the people you care about lose sight of what truly matters. Family relationships require the same kind of maintenance as a house, regular attention and care, but also firm boundaries and clear understanding of who owns what. The most important lesson from this experience is that dignity and independence aren't things you give up just because someone else thinks they know what's best for you. Age doesn't automatically make you incapable of managing your own life, and being someone's parent doesn't give them the right to override your choices about your future. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children is teaching them that love doesn't mean surrender and that respect is earned through actions, not assumed through relationships. I'm proud that I stood up for myself and my home, and I'm grateful that Daniel eventually learned to respect the woman who taught him the value of hard work and perseverance. As I finish this story, I want you to think about the relationships in your own life. Have you ever felt pressured to make decisions that didn't feel right to you? Have you learned to distinguish between genuine concern and manipulative control? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts about family boundaries and the difference between helping someone and taking over their life. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear about the importance of standing up for yourself. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family relationships and the courage it takes to protect what matters most. Remember that sometimes the people we love most are the ones we need to say no to the strongest. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you find the strength to defend your own boundaries when you need it most. May you always have the courage to protect what you've built with your own hands and heart.